We are on the story of God's people, part 3, chapter 7, the friends of Caesar. And we're actually getting pretty close to the New Testament here. It's going to be only a few weeks. We have basically to look at Herod the Great after today, which will take a few weeks. But for now, we're remembering these three men from last week, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Their unofficial alliance, the triumvirate, was the most powerful alliance. They basically ran Rome, every territory that Rome had under its control. These men could pretty much do what they wanted to with the Senate, with the army. They had an enormous power that nobody wanted to confront. When Crassus died, it upset the balance of power between them, and Pompey and Julius Caesar started to mistrust each other, started to fear each other, and it led to Pompey telling Caesar, "You have to abandon your troops, send them home." Caesar said no and marched on Rome itself. Pompey fled with many of the senators. And the last thing we looked at last time was that Julius Caesar released Aristobulus, the rebellious younger brother of the Jewish high priest Hyrcanus. And he sent Aristobulus with a small army back to Syria, to Judea, that region, in order to stir up the population against Pompey. Because Hyrcanus and Antipater, the people currently in charge over there, were on Pompey's side, and they supported him in the civil war. But on the way there, Aristobulus, before he reached Syria, was murdered by Pompey's men, and his son also was executed. So, I think who's in charge of Judea right now? Hyrcanus and his friend Antipater. And they're on the side of Pompey in this war. And they're going to hope Pompey wins this war. Who's actually going to win, though, do you think? Just based on who's more famous. That's going to be Julius Caesar. And so that's going to be, that's going to cause some problems in Israel, potentially, as a result of the outcome of this war. But Caesar and Pompey were both master tacticians, and they tried for a year. There wasn't a whole lot of actual fighting, but they tried for about a year and a half to outmaneuver each other and gain the advantage indirectly against each other, swing the balance of power in their favor. And Pompey actually had the most success tactically. He is the one. He came actually very close once to defeating Caesar for good, very close. But Pompey's allies grew very impatient with how long the war was dragging on, and they pressured him into moving against Caesar sooner than he thought was wise. He gave in to them, and in the battle that followed, Pompey's army was badly defeated. And that was the turning point in the war. That was really what settled it, that defeat. And with his wife, his son, and his most loyal supporters, Pompey fled to Egypt. Now, unfortunately, Pompey arrived in Egypt at a bit of a bad time. So, to understand what happened next, we have to see what the situation was there. So for 3 years, Egypt had been ruled by these two people. That's Ptolemy the 13th on the black background and Cleopatra the 7th. And yes, this is the famous Cleopatra. Right here, Cleopatra the 7th. So Ptolemy and Cleopatra. And the Ptolemies, if you remember, they were Greek, Macedonian specifically. They were descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. And they had been calling themselves pharaohs, ruling Egypt, but they weren't actually Egyptian themselves. And Cleopatra the 7th, as far as we know, was the only member of the family to ever take the time to learn the Egyptian language, surprisingly. But Ptolemy the 13th here was both Cleopatra's husband and her younger brother. Actually, Cleopatra was in her early 20s at this time. Ptolemy was 14 and was only 11 when he became pharaoh. So imagine what this relationship was like. Ptolemy was technically the pharaoh, but Cleopatra, being much older than him, beginning life as his big sister and not respecting him in the way that he wanted her to. It just, yeah, she's the one who really ran the country. She's the one who had the power. And 3 years into their reign, both Ptolemy and his regent, especially the man who was supposed to be helping Ptolemy rule, he was the one who really resented this. Pothinus was his name. Ptolemy and his regent, Pothinus, conspired to overthrow Cleopatra. So Cleopatra ended up fleeing into Syria, where she was able to raise an army to oppose her brother. Okay, so it was during that brief period of peace between Cleopatra's flight and her return that Pompey arrived defeated in Egypt. And as Pompey's ship approached the Egyptian coast, a delegation came out in a small boat to bring him to shore. And this is in the words of the Roman historian Plutarch, who wrote a biography of many of the lives of great Roman and Greek heroes. Plutarch says, after some last words to his friends, Pompey went into the boat, and since it was a long distance from the ship to the land, and none of his companions in the boat were saying anything, he turned to Septimus, one of the men who had come out to meet him, and said, "Surely I am not mistaken, and you are an old comrade of mine." Septimus merely nodded. So then, since there was profound silence again, Pompey took a little roll containing a speech written by him in Greek, which he had prepared for his meeting with Ptolemy. Of course, the Ptolemies would speak Greek rather than Latin. So he began reading it, rehearsing his speech to Ptolemy. Then, as they drew near the shore, Cornelia, Pompey's wife on the ship, together with some of his friends, stood on the ship, watching with great anxiety for the outcome. She began to take heart when she saw many of the king's people assembling at the landing, as if to give him an honorable welcome. But at this point, while Pompey was clasping the hand of Philip that he might rise to his feet more easily, Septimus, from behind, ran him through the body with his sword. Then Salvius next, and then Achillas drew their daggers and stabbed him. And Pompey, drawing his toga down over his face with both hands, without an act or a word that was unworthy of himself, but only with a groan, submitted to their blows. He was 59 years old, and his life ended only one day after his birthday. When the people on the ships beheld the murder, they uttered a wailing cry that could be heard as far as the shore, and weighing anchor quickly, took to flight. The Egyptians cut off Pompey's head and threw the rest of his body unclothed out of the boat. So many of the Jews, especially those who were on Aristobulus' side in Judea, hated Pompey very deeply and saw this as God's judgment on him. But Plutarch continues, this was the end of Pompey, but not long afterwards, Caesar came to Egypt and found it filled with this terrible deed. From the man who brought him Pompey's head, he turned away with loathing, as from an assassin. That's what the picture is of there. And on receiving Pompey's seal ring, he burst into tears. And those who had killed Pompey, he put to death. So even though Pompey was Julius Caesar's enemy, in today's terms we could call them more of frenemies. Okay, they were political enemies, political on different sides of the war. They competed with each other for power, but they respected each other deeply. And they were very close personal acquaintances. Pompey's death did not please Julius Caesar in any way, but it was orchestrated actually by Pothinus, Ptolemy's regent, the one who really craved power in Egypt. Yeah, Pothinus had ordered Pompey assassinated in an attempt to gain favor with Julius Caesar. And, of course, that did not work. And despite the recent war, he still had a very deep respect for Pompey, but he had no respect, Caesar had no respect at all for traitors and murderers. He had a very strong sense of honor. And he demanded that a very large payment be made to Pompey's family by the Egyptians as restitution for this act. And he also, while he was there in Egypt, vowed to settle the dispute between Ptolemy and Cleopatra, kind of like how Pompey had settled the dispute between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus in Judea. So, Pompey had summoned both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus to meet him in Damascus. Caesar did a very similar thing. He summoned both Ptolemy and Cleopatra to meet with him in Alexandria so that he could settle their dispute. And we've seen this slide before. This is where Alexandria is in Egypt. And that little island outcropping thing is where the great lighthouse of Alexandria used to stand at one point. But while Caesar, Cleopatra, Ptolemy, and the other heads of state were meeting in the royal district of Alexandria, Pothinus, the regent of Ptolemy, Pothinus secretly sent orders for the Egyptian army to come and besiege the city, to surround it. And Pothinus was later caught sending messages to the army, and Caesar had him killed. But it was too late at that point to stop what was happening. And Caesar was greatly outnumbered by the Egyptians. He didn't have his whole army with him in Egypt. And Caesar and his men had to barricade themselves inside the royal district. They didn't even control the whole city. Cleopatra, for her part, smuggled herself into the royal quarter in a laundry bag and came to Caesar secretly and used her feminine charms to convince him to take her side. So Caesar and Cleopatra ended up becoming lovers, at least for a while. And Caesar was very completely and obviously on her side. He didn't go as far as to just give her the country, though. What he did, the decision that he publicly announced, was that Ptolemy and Cleopatra should go back to being joint rulers, as their father had intended, as they were before. And this, of course, would have meant giving the real power back to Cleopatra. So Ptolemy refused to submit to the decision, and open war broke out between his army and Caesar's men. And this place, this outcropping, this little island here, was a significant point in the war, in the siege of Alexandria, as it's known. The Caesar controlled the island itself, but skirmishes were fought over the bridge between the island and the mainland. And in one of those battles, Caesar himself almost died. He had to swim back to where they had launched from, holding some important papers in his hand above the water so they wouldn't get wet. It was he was in a tight spot, and it was clear to everyone there. But the most important thing, the most significant thing, rather, that Caesar accomplished during this siege was he set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor. And that started a fire that spread to the city. And some very important buildings were damaged in that fire, including the Great Library of Alexandria. And some people have estimated that up to 40,000 books and papyrus scrolls may have been destroyed in that fire. But it took a long time for any reinforcements to come to Caesar in Egypt because it was winter. And we know from the New Testament, from the book of Acts, the Mediterranean Sea is dangerous in winter. You don't sail in winter. At least not with boats the size they had back then. It isn't safe. So Caesar was kind of isolated with the men he had, the small group he had, until winter was over and more people could join him. And despite a few successful maneuvers, it was clear that he needed help. And that is where we get back to the story of Judea and Antipater. Specifically, Antipater made one of the most important political decisions of his life at this time. Remember, Antipater is the personal friend of Hyrcanus. He doesn't officially have power in Judea, but as the friend of Hyrcanus, he's basically running the country for him. And Antipater is an Idumean, an Edomite, somebody whose ancestors were forced to convert to Judaism, not actually that many generations ago. And he's also going to be, and we'll get there today actually, the father of Herod the Great. So Antipater decided that he was going to join the army that was going to relieve Julius Caesar. Remember, Hyrcanus and Antipater, they were on Pompey's side. They supported Pompey during the war. And now that the war is over, if Caesar gains power, it's not necessarily going to be good for Judea. It's not going to be good for them in particular. So Antipater acts very fast, takes advantage of the opportunity he has to come to Caesar's aid, to show that he is loyal to Julius Caesar. He took an elite force of 30,000 Jews, and he went to join the relief army that was coming down from Syria. And that's the red line. coming down the coast. Antipater joins that red line, becomes part of it from Jerusalem. And they go down into Egypt, all the way over to Alexandria. And even on the way, the Jews, and particularly Antipater, showed themselves very useful, very courageous, and skillful in battle. And when they reached Alexandria, remember there were a lot of Jews living in Alexandria as well. And Antipater and his people helped bring those Jews to Caesar's side. So they made a big difference in this campaign and had a lot to do with its success. And it was a success. The siege was lifted. Julius Caesar and his allies were victorious. Ptolemy and his people fled, and in the mess and the chaos of that, Ptolemy ended up drowning. So he was dead, and Cleopatra was put back in charge of the country, along with another even younger brother that she had. He was named the next Ptolemy, Ptolemy the 14th. And so Julius Caesar, after setting things in order in Egypt and taking a 2-month luxury cruise down the Nile with Cleopatra, Caesar traveled back to Syria, and he's the purple line going up the coast. He traveled all the way back up to Syria and met there with the people who had helped him. And Hyrcanus was there, Antipater was there. Caesar honored Antipater because of his help with a Roman citizenship and tax exemption for his family. Antipater's family didn't have to pay taxes to Rome. And they were considered Roman citizens, which we also know from the New Testament was a big deal. And he also confirmed Hyrcanus in his role as high priest. So, because of this act, he didn't see them as enemies, he saw them as allies. And it turned out to be a very good thing for Judea. They got back a little bit of the land that they had lost, and they got back a lot of independence that they had lost after Pompey's takeover. But they weren't the only ones there in Syria at this meeting. Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus II, or Aristobulus had 2 sons, Antigonus and Alexander. Alexander got executed, so Antigonus is the only one left to carry on his father's legacy of rebellion. But Antigonus took advantage of this opportunity to come before Caesar with his personal complaints. Remember, his father, Aristobulus, and his brother, Alexander, were killed by Pompey's people after declaring loyalty to Caesar. So Antigonus thought, I should be the one that Caesar honors. I'm the one who's been on his side, at least my family has, from the beginning here. And he accused Hyrcanus and Antipater of insincerity, of switching to his side just to save themselves, and not because of any personal loyalty, and thought that Caesar should take his side instead of theirs. And this is from The Jewish War by Josephus, what he says. At this, when he heard these words, Antipater threw away his garments and displayed the great number of wounds he had received in Egypt. And he said that as to his good will to Caesar, there was no need for him to say a word, because his body cried aloud. He also wondered at Antigonus's boldness, since he was the son of a fugitive and an enemy to the Romans, that he should undertake to accuse other men before the Roman governor, and endeavor to gain power for himself, when he ought to be content that he was allowed to live. When Caesar heard this, he declared Hyrcanus to be the most worthy of the high priesthood, and he gave leave to Antipater to choose whatever authority he pleased. So Antipater was appointed procurator of all Judea. So he is the Roman official now over Judea, which means he's not just Hyrcanus's friend who runs things, who manages things for him. He actually outranks Hyrcanus in the eyes of the Romans. He's the one who is officially now in charge. Antipater also obtained permission to rebuild those walls of his country that had been thrown down. And Caesar had a record of these honors that he gave to Antipater engraved in Jerusalem, that they might stand there as indications of his own justice and of the virtue of Antipater. As soon as Antipater had conducted Caesar out of Syria, he returned to Judea. The first thing he did was to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, which Pompey had overthrown. Then he went over the whole country to advise some, threaten others, and quiet the unrest that filled the land. He settled the affairs of the country by himself because he saw that Hyrcanus was ineffective and not fit to manage a kingdom. He appointed his eldest son, Phasael, governor of Jerusalem, and he made his second son, Herod, who was very young, about 25 years old at this point, the governor of Galilee. So Antipater is governing the whole nation. His first son, Phasael, is governor of Jerusalem, which means he has control of Judea, the southern part. Herod is the governor of Galilee, the northern and less important part. Meanwhile, Caesar returned to Rome and appointed several new senators. And he used his now unchallenged power to enact several important reforms. We still use his calendar, of course, and he did a lot of other things fixing up Roman society, a lot of things that really needed to be done. And the common people continued to love him. He was still their hero, and in general, they really approved of the things that he was doing. The people who didn't approve of what he was doing were the Senate. A lot of the members of the Senate began to worry that with no one to keep Caesar in check, the Roman Republic was on its way to becoming a dictatorship. The Senate didn't have the strength to stand up to him. And though Caesar insisted that he had no desire to be a king, he also showed no signs of ever giving up power. He even established a cult for people who wanted to worship him. And seeing no other way to preserve the republic, to preserve the form of government they had, some of the Senate members, led by two men named Brutus and Cassius, formed a conspiracy against Caesar, and on the 15th of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated. And this is Plutarch's account of the event. Those who were not aware of the plot were filled with confusion and horror at what was going on. They dared not run away, nor did they go to Caesar's help, nor even utter a word. But those who had prepared themselves for the murder bared each of them his dagger. And Caesar, hemmed in on all sides, whichever way he turned, confronted blows of weapons aimed at his face and eyes, and was driven hither and thither like a wild beast. Brutus also gave him one blow to the groin. And it is said by some writers that although Caesar defended himself against the rest, and darted this way and that, and cried aloud, when he saw that Brutus had drawn his dagger, He pulled his toga down over his head and sank, either by chance or because pushed there by his murderers, against the pedestal on which the statue of Pompey stood. And the pedestal was drenched with his blood, so that one might even have thought that Pompey himself was presiding over this vengeance upon his enemy, who now lay prostrate at his feet, quivering from a multitude of wounds. For it is said that Caesar received 23 wounds, and many of the conspirators were wounded by one another as they struggled to plant all those blows in one body. The conspirators believed that they were defending the Republic, but it was one of the greatest miscalculations in history. This action, more than anything else, doomed the Republic and turned the people themselves, the mass of Romans, against the Senate, and led to the rise of Caesar Augustus, as we will get to later. But next week we'll turn our attention away from Rome for a while and back to Judea, to the man who would later become known as Herod the Great. I have here, just to close, Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 and 20 through 28. And if you would like to find that and read it for us, that would be great. Many of the men that we've been reading about, the Romans, from their own point of view, this was the kind of leader that the Romans looked up to, that the Gentiles in general looked up to. This was the ideal man. Pompey, Julius Caesar, these hero kings. And from their stories, we can see even more powerfully the contrast between the kind of leader they were and the kind of leader Christ was. Matthew 20, 25 through 28. It says, "But Jesus called them to himself and said, 'You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.'" And just because of our human nature, we have a tendency to view leadership in terms of domination and exercising power, and rather than a position from which to serve the people under them. And even the Roman senators, as advanced in the terms of those days as their form of government was, they saw themselves and their position mainly in terms of the power they were able to exercise and the prestige they were able to bring to themselves. And the mindset that we should have toward leadership and what makes a man a hero, what makes a man a noble example that we should try to follow, is completely different. Any thoughts or questions before we close today? All right. Father, thank you for preserving the history of your people for us and the nations around them. Thank you for sending Christ exactly when you did, to step into this world and show it up for what it was, to provide a contrast of what we're like and what you're like, what your values are compared to ours, and how far we fall short, even in our best attempts. Help us to follow Christ completely, wholeheartedly, and not allow the world's standards, to not let the world's idea of humanity and what we ought to be, to shape our understanding of ourselves. And give us the courage to be different, completely, radically, fundamentally different from the people around us, for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.